Mediumship that falls under the category of intelligent manifestations. And I should tell you, this was part of a seminar on mediumship that involved 7 people. And I can only represent myself, but I'll try to make this make sense by itself. So I'll be touching on various kinds of psychography, hearing, speaking, and seeing mediums, and different levels of trance. And all of these are examined and explained in the literature of Spiritism, of course. I'll discuss the importance of intelligent manifestations to our development and the need on our part, and especially on the part of mediums, to apply this knowledge that we've gained so that we can make even greater use, gain greater and ever more beneficial access to the higher knowledge afforded by these communications. So, to begin, you've heard it said that we're all mediums. That is to say, we're all influenced by the spirit world, and spirits are all around us. There's a constant interaction between our two worlds. But there are those whom we label as having ostensible mediumship, which means that their mediumship is, per the definition of the word, and bring that up. Let's see. It's been a while here. It's the arrow. The arrow there? The space bar. That'll work. Okay, thank you. Ostensible. Okay, the definition of the word here: apparent, evident, or conspicuous. And so these are the ones that we recognize as mediums. In other words, these are the true intermediaries between spirits and incarnates. And we call these evidences of conspicuous mediumship manifestations. And there are physical manifestations, and there are intelligent manifestations. So now let's ask this question. What's the difference between physical and intelligent manifestations? Well, Allan Kardec, the founder of Spiritism, described physical manifestations as those phenomena which impress our senses, such as the production of sounds and the movement and displacement of solid bodies. But then he also concluded that after observing the phenomenon of the turning tables, which we see depicted here, that it must have an intelligent cause. In fact, it's this conclusion that led him to modify the famous axiom of science, which is this, that every effect must have a cause, and he changed that to claim that every intelligent effect must have an intelligent cause. So he goes on to give further illumination on this point in the Medium's book with the example of the weather vane, and we see that here. Okay, he points out that if the wind blows in a certain direction, the weather vane will turn accordingly. We expect that to happen. But if there is evidence of free and voluntary action expressive of intention and transmitting or replying to a thought, for instance, if the wind is blowing this way but the weather vane goes that way, then we may expect this to be evidence of an intelligence. And he points out, of course, Kardec points out that it doesn't even have to be witty or wise, just evidence. So, now given all this, let's rephrase our question and ask, why doesn't the evidence of an intelligent cause make the turning table an intelligent manifestation? And here finally is the answer given to Kardec by the spirits. And they say intelligent effects are those for the production of which the spirit makes use of the medium's brain. Okay? You know, I have to confess that I found it comforting to find out that this answer was given as an explanation as to why pneumatographic writing or direct writing is considered to be a physical phenomenon. Allan Kardec himself argued against this. He argued strongly to the contrary, that he believed it was an intelligent manifestation because he argued it was used to create intelligent communications and from the spirit. But the spirits insisted and said, no, this is not. They said the medium's brain has to be involved. So with pneumatographic writing, which is pictured here, it's produced with the help of physical elements provided by both the medium and the paraspirit of the communicating spirit involved. But it has nothing to do with the medium's brain. So according to the spirits, it's physical by that definition. By the way, I just want to point out this particular picture here is Rembrandt's. It's called Belshazzar's Feast. depicts a scene from the book of Daniel. In here, a hand materialized before the eyes of Belshazzar, an ancient king of Babylon, and his subjects. They had recently stolen and profaned sacred objects from a Jerusalem temple. So they were drinking wine from sacred vessels and so on. And the materialized hand wrote a message of imminent doom on the wall. And later Belshazzar was killed, his kingdom was overrun by the Persians. And they say this is where the phrase, the writings on the wall, comes from. Okay, the writings on the wall. But anyway, getting back to the phenomenon of the turning table, Kardec explains it's an infusion of the vital principle which causes the table to turn. And the vital principle, as you may know, is a modification of the cosmic principle from which all things physical are derived. And it's the presence of the vital principle that gives life. Okay, so the table, you could say, so to speak, temporarily comes to life. But this is an infusion from another source. It is not intelligent, and the medium's brain is not used to bring this about. So, therefore, it's a physical manifestation. So I hope everybody's thoroughly confused now. On the other hand, the phenomenon of psychography is an intelligent manifestation precisely because it does make use of the medium's brain to produce it. So there we have it. Now, we may ask, what manifestations are intelligent by this definition? So now we get into it. To start, in addition to writing, via the use of the medium's brain, aka psychography, we have hearing mediumship, also known as clairaudience, seeing mediumship, known as clairvoyance, speaking mediumship, also known as psychophony, and some mediums are conscious of the communication they receive from spirits, some are unconscious, some are in light trance, some in deep trance, some exercise control through moral ascendancy, and some maintain control through intellectual superiority. Okay, and more than a few have no control at all, as we have seen many times in the literature. People who are possessed in some way, or you should say obsessed. Possession does not exist according to Spiritism. But before we become overwhelmed by all these varieties of intelligent manifestations, it may be helpful to remember the words of Richard Simonetti from his book, Mediumship, Everything You Needed to Know. I think he left out, but we're afraid to ask, in which he states this: these faculties aren't all that different in their essence. They're specialties only. So he's saying that there's a great similarity in the source, but the way that it's presented, the way that it's carved up and presented to us has a lot to do with the medium themselves, and we're going to get into that. So in other words, these manifestations have this similarity. There's an attunement between the communicating spirit and the medium, but each medium brings his or her own special aptitude. Simonetti compares this to the specialized hearing of musicians, which we would call a musical ear. You know, we know that some people can't carry a tune to save their lives, and in search of the key and so on. Or others, people can hear something once, sit down at the piano and play it beautifully. How is that? Well, anyway, we've already mentioned the opposite of pneumatography, which is psychography. So it's logical, maybe we should next mention the opposite of another pneuma, pneumatophony, which is the direct production of sounds by spirits. Its opposite is psychophony, or speaking mediums. Now there are two types of speaking mediums, conscious and unconscious. The conscious medium, working in a light trance, has at least some idea of what he or she is saying. And this is quite common. The unconscious medium is less common. They're in a deeper trance, and they have no memory of the communication, largely. But in either case, we can say this: the speaking medium often gives utterance to instructions far above the reach of his own ideas, intelligence, knowledge. And a variation of this type of medium is the hearing medium. Okay? And as it says here, these mediums hear the voices of spirits. Sometimes it's an inner voice that speaks to the interior consciousness, and sometimes it's an exterior voice, clear and distinct as that of a person in the flesh. And this is from the medium's book, of course. This type of medium often serves as a sort of interpreter between the communicating spirit and persons who do not possess mediumistic abilities. We may recall this was the case with Allan Kardec himself. He was not a medium, but he made use of mediums who transmitted these messages, and he codified and brought all this together and made sense of it. So, moving on, then there's the seeing medium. Okay, seeing mediums are spirits when awake, who see spirits, when they're awake, or in some cases in the state between sleep and waking. In other words, seeing spirits in your dreams doesn't make you a seeing medium. We all have dreams. We can hopefully recall the difference where sometimes you feel that you have a dream where you're in the spirit world and you have maybe vague memories of it. This is something everyone has, but that doesn't make us a medium. So there's an interesting anecdote about a seeing medium in chapter 14 of the medium's book. It talks about a seeing medium at the opera, and he saw several spirits sitting in vacant seats watching the performance, several spirits who were actively engaged in either supporting the efforts or deriding them, mocking them. There was even an instance where a spirit came up to and talked to the medium and said, well, they're not doing so well. I better get up there and help them. He gets up, gets behind them, and seems to be making passes over the opera singers, and they did get noticeably better. But this is something, though, that we have to say doesn't happen, and it's an everyday occurrence. That would be for the simple reason that frequent sightings of spirits could be very disruptive to the normal activities of most incarnates. And for instance, if I were to suddenly see a spirit in the back of the room here, I might forget altogether what I'm talking about. I'd stand before you open-mouthed and dumbfounded. And of course, this could happen without seeing a spirit. But anyway, moving on. Earlier I mentioned trance states, and I'll briefly touch upon this. Trance can overlap with mediumship. There's a communication by a spirit through a person in a trance state. Or it can differ significantly in that it can simply be an altered state in which a spirit incarnated in a physical body is simply significantly more free from the body for a period of time, and this gives them the ability to see, to hear, and even to interact with spirits in the spirit world. And but a person in a trance state does not necessarily serve as an instrument of communication for another spirit. We could say a square is always a rectangle, but a rectangle is not always a square. Maybe remember this from your mathematics. I don't know if that always applies here. But anyway, some of the various types of trance state are, to give you a few here, we have spontaneous trance, induced trance, we have somnambulic trance, and finally ecstatic trance. Okay? Now, spontaneous trance simply means that which occurs naturally. Okay? Whereas induced trance is brought about by artificial means. So, in other words, it can be hypnosis, for instance. One type of spontaneous trance is somnambulic trance. We see that here. It's also known as sleepwalking. The somnambulist expresses their thoughts, their own thoughts, and the medium expresses those of another. But the spirit who communicates through an ordinary medium may do so through a somnambulist, and there are a lot of examples of this. So it does occasionally overlap with mediumship. The last state that I've listed, ecstatic trance, okay, here we see that here, is a state in which the subject experiences a bliss of a higher world. They encounter a higher spiritual world, a happier world than their own. And they get this blissful feeling. And this is a case where we're told the connection of the trance subject spirit with their body can be extremely tenuous. There's a real danger that the connection could be broken. And the subject, enraptured with that world, sees their own world as empty and meaningless, and may need to be reminded about those that they care about, that he or she cares about, in order to bring them back to this world. And if the connection is broken, they're probably going to find out that they're barred from more than a glimpse of that world anyway, because they lack the necessary spiritual development to have a longer stay. So they're just on vacation, you might say. Okay, now having gone over all these various types of mediumship, these kinds of mediumship, how do we fit this immense variety into a framework that makes sense to us And I asked myself this question as I was preparing this speech, and for some reason an old quotation from Marshall McLuhan kept coming into my head. The medium is the message. There's Marshall. And he was a communications theorist. He gained fame in the 1960s with a book, Understanding Media. That's where the quote can be found. And you know, sometimes I find it helpful to go outside of Spiritism to look at things, and quite often, practically nearly every time when I come back to Spiritism, I see something that I didn't see before. It just sort of helps me to focus. I look outside and then come back, and I see something that was there all the time, and usually it's more than the outside source. I mean, practically always more than the outside source. But I find that helpful to do that. So anyway, I had resisted this for quite a while, but finally I did look into it. And my understanding of this rather cryptic quote was that it seemed to suggest that the medium was more important than the message itself. And this was an idea I rejected out of hand. Besides, I reasoned that McLuhan wasn't really talking about mediumship. He was talking about TV, radio, newspapers, books, movies, etc. But I decided finally to look more closely, and I learned that he defined the word medium as any extension of ourselves. And I began to see there might be an application here. He was not saying that the medium was more important than the message, but he was saying that the choice of the medium had an effect on the content of the message. So if we consider that the content and style of communications of a spirit are affected by the instrument chosen for their transmission, in other words, the medium, who is an extension of the spirit, and that the medium's transmission of their message is an extension of the medium, we begin to see there's something can apply here. There's an importance of understanding that effect. So the choice of a medium can dramatically affect the how and the what of the message being delivered. So of course, it should be pointed out this relationship between the choice of the medium and the ramifications of that choice is something that actually was well known and described in minute detail in Spiritist literature over 100 years before McLuhan made his famous quote. But if we can agree that the main goals of mediumship within a Spiritist framework are to disseminate higher knowledge from the spirit plane and to give charitable aid to both incarnates and discarnates, we can see how the choice of the medium who acts as the intermediary is very important indeed. Conscious mediums, semi-mechanical mediums, which are semi-conscious, you might have guessed that. Half and half, there you go. So, and then inspirational mediums, which is a derivation of intuitive mediums. And then finally, presentient mediums, another further specialization of intuitive mediums. So looking at some definitions here. First, we have mechanical mediums. They have no knowledge of, no participation in the communication from the spirit. And it's for this reason that mechanical mediumship is considered precious, in the sense that because the medium is completely unaware of what he or she is writing, all doubt that the writing is independent of the medium's mind is removed. So for the doubting Thomases out there, check out the mechanical mediums. Okay. Then we move on to intuitive mediums. I'm just going to kind of spot check these. In intuitive mediumship, the spirit acts directly on the medium's soul. In other words, the thought communicated are those of the spirit, and they precede the action of writing. That's important to note. The medium becomes aware of the thoughts as they're writing them, but they do precede. This type of medium is often objected to. It's objected that there is no way of telling that the medium isn't simply writing their own thoughts. But if, as Kardec suggests, those thoughts appear contrary to the ideas and convictions as well as beyond the knowledge and intellectual capacity of the medium, then we can say with some certainty that the thoughts are not his or her own. So that's the test, the acid test. Moving on, we have semi-mechanical mediums, half and half. As you said there, in the case of semi-mechanical, the thought of the spirit neither precedes or follows the act of writing. So you see I have a picture here of people accompanying one another side by side on the piano, to get the idea there. So instead, the medium feels an impulsion given to the hand independently of their will, but at the same time, they know what's going on, they know what they're writing. And okay, then we have inspirational mediums. And they're in fact a variety of the intuitive medium, as I mentioned, with this difference that the intervention of an occult power is much less evident in this case. So even less so than with the other type, going back, that was the intuitive medium, excuse me. So that the inspirational medium is more difficult to distinguish their own thought from that which is suggested. And it's been said that the majority of those here on earth whom we consider to be geniuses are in fact inspirational mediums. If we look back at some of the great classics in literature, we sometimes see evidence even of an awareness on the part of the writer of these great books that they are being influenced by a greater intelligence. We see this a lot in antiquity. Here are two of the greatest writers of antiquity, Homer, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, and also we have here Dante Alighieri, who wrote the Divine Comedy, and John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost. All of these writers, in their writing, actually appealed to a higher source of inspiration. For instance, here we have an example of this in Homer's The Iliad. He makes his appeal to Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, for inspiration. So he says, "Sing, goddess, the anger of Peleus' son Achilles, and its devastation, which put pains thousandfold upon the Achaeans, hurled in their multitudes to the house of Hades." So there's that appeal and asking for help. Help me to be inspired. We can find these appeals throughout classical literature, asking for this inspiration to tell their stories. Now lastly, we come to presentient mediums. Here we have a picture of Edgar Cayce. You may be familiar with this one. He's the sleeping prophet, known as the sleeping prophet. He predicted that Atlantis would be found somewhere in the 1960s, sometime. And in fact, there was a discovery of what appears to be a road underwater off the coast of Bimini here in Florida. I'm sure we've seen documentaries on this on TV. And some say these are Atlantean in origin. Another example of this would be Divaldo Franco. He's psychographed work by Joanna de Angelis, The New Era, which we may be more familiar with. The idea of predicting what is to come. So this faculty sometimes is the result of a second sight, as it says here, by which they obtain glimpses of the consequences of things present, and thus perceive the filiation of things to come. But it's also in many cases the result of an occult communication. We can say that at least some of those who are called fortune tellers, for instance, actually have this ability. And it's sometimes mediumship, then it's an actual communication from a spirit, sometimes a form of trance, as it is called here, second sight. All right, finally, let's move on to talk more about the importance of psychographic writing. Why is it important? Well, as I mentioned, it's precisely because the medium's intelligence is engaged that psychography, which is the written thought of a spirit using the mind of a medium, represents a quantum leap in the communication between spirits and human beings. Kardec puts it well when he says this. He says, of all the means of communication with spirits, manual writing is the simplest, most convenient, and most complete, for it enables us to establish regular and continuous relations with spirits, and thus to ascertain their nature and quality, to learn their thoughts, and to appreciate them at their full value. So you may recall, way back at the beginning, we talked about in our discussion about how Kardec pointed out that the turning tables, the raps, etc., were physical manifestations. But Kardec also sensed from these things that something more serious was behind these phenomena, something more than the mere entertainment or fad of the day. And this something greater is what kept Kardec's interest, and his interest was soon rewarded by the spirits themselves, who inspired the development of ever more sophisticated means of communicating. So we saw that this progression from the turning tables to planchettes to finally to dispensing altogether with the pencil holder, which all the planchette really is, so that there was greater ease and flexibility in the communication through the spirit, from the spirit through the medium. So they were able to transmit with greater clarity, greater and greater clarity, more and more complex ideas. And this very complexity came to serve as a proof that these were not merely the thoughts of the mediums involved. And this provided really the best defense against the charge of animism, which we see pictured here. Well, we see the definition here, the situation in which the medium's subconscious mind, rather than a spiritual individuality, is the source of a mediumistic message. Okay, so basically psychography came into its own with these developments. And through psychographic mediums like Chico Xavier, Divaldo Franco, and others, we were given access to a greater world. In fact, one of the books in the Andre Luis series is called In the Greater World. This points to one of the basic teachings of Spiritism, which is that the spirit world is the greater world. It existed before the material and will continue to exist after the material world has passed away. So psychography then is immensely important for us because we're made privy to knowledge that is above and beyond the limitations of our own world. This gives us a sense of the true meaning of St. Paul's words to Barnabas in the book Paul and Stephen by the Spirit Emmanuel. He says, "Where would we be without mediumship? We would have to rely on the wisdom of men." And the implication here is that of that such reliance would like the blind leading the blind on both falling into the pit. So, in fact, in the Gospel according to Spiritism, which was written over 150 years ago, we are told that the human race on earth is only a small portion of the whole of humanity that exists beyond the confines of earth. And further, that we're not representative of the whole of humanity, in much the same way that people in hospitals and prisons are not representative of the total population in a city. So we may not find it to our liking to be told that we of earth are the sick, the injured, the corrupt, the vice-ridden. We don't want to hear that. But Spiritism does hold out the hope to us that just as sick people leave the hospital when they're cured, and inmates who have served their sentences leave prison, the spirits of men and women on earth will also leave Earth's environment and go on to happier realms once they rid themselves of their moral frailties. So that's why we're here. So it's precisely here that psychographic writing is of greatest importance, not only in transmitting that message to us, but in giving us glimpses of these other worlds, these other mansions, as Jesus calls them. Both those that are more blissful and those that are filled with suffering, even greater than our own. So that gives us a sense of perspective, a greater clarity of understanding for the consequences of our good and bad actions, and offers a source of inspiration. So, if we look at it, Chico Xavier, Francisco Candido Xavier alone wrote over 400 books. That alone is a proof to me that there's something going on here beyond one man. And we can compare this to 80 books written by Agatha Christie. She was a prolific writer, 80 books. And 150 books written by R.L. Stein, who is said to have been rather formulaic in his approach to writing. Just keep belting out the same formula over and over, just change the characters' names. So he managed to make it to 150 books. 400 plus for Chico Xavier. How can one man write so many books? I don't think it's possible. So he had to have been a medium, inspired by higher spirits. That's the conclusion that I draw. So, now it also says here that this is one of the most, this mediumistic faculty of writing is the one which is most susceptible, of being developed by exercise. And it looks to me like Chico, who had so many books, had plenty of practice, I'd say. Now for me, moving on, this treasure trove of books by Chico Xavier and other psychographic authors, this is the very foundation of Spiritism. These books, in these books, we're truly transported to other worlds. For instance, going back to 2,000 years ago, to the time of the ancient Romans. In the book 2,000 Years Ago, by the same title, to see the painful spiritual growth of the proud senator Publius Lentulus, seeing him again reincarnated as the Greek slave Nestorius in the book 50 years later. In other examples, going back to the very foundation of the earth, 4.6 billion years ago, in On the Way to the Light, where we are told that Jesus was a pure spirit before the very formation of the earth. Gives us a really strong perspective on our development comparatively. And moving on, going on to experience the suffering and the ultimate triumph of the great heroine of the Middle Ages, Joan of Arc, and in the book by the same name. And then finally, encountering the dramatic conversion of Saul of Tarsus and the struggles of the early Christians in the book Paul and Stephen. So there's so much there for us. Take a lifetime to read, even some of them, it seems to me. So, but let me end, I'd like to end now, by saying that what is truly important about these mediumistic books, and all mediumistic communications that are inspired by the higher spirits, is the clear understanding that they present of the path we all need to follow to reach our ultimate goal, which is a goal shared by all religions, to become one with God. And this clear path is doubly important to those who have been entrusted with the task of mediumship. It's absolutely essential that those who have this gift should engage in a continual study to improve their minds, to strive continuously to overcome negative influences of the less advanced spirits by being ever vigilant regarding their own thoughts, educating themselves, and seeking to use their gift to help others. The twin admonitions of Spiritism. Educate yourself and help one another. Doubly important for mediums. So, mediums who follow this advice are enabled to bring us a clear vision of the greater world. And by doing so, they show us as an encouragement the wonders that await us if we can persevere in our trials on earth, deriving ever greater benefit from these trials through an increased awareness of the reasons that we must endure them. And it's this increased awareness that Jesus was referring to when he said, "To those who have, more will be given." Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.